Hi, Lou here to talk about the value in games of constraints, how constraints work in games, how players look at them. In other words, I'm going to talk from a player or a gameplay point of view rather than a game designer point of view. And the usual caveat, these slides are very wordy to benefit those who might have impaired hearing or want lots of text notes, and I expect most people to listen to this rather than to watch it. Well, I've talked and written about how a game designer can make better games faster by setting constraints for himself. And my discussion here about the players and gameplay is with the intent that it'll help you be more aware of the nuances of game design. So constraints are inherent to games. The very nature of a game is that it provides a set of constraints, necessarily artificial constraints. The whole idea of a game is artificial. And those are the rules and mechanics of the game within which the players act. When hobby games were largely consequence-based, which is not so nowadays, you expected to have to earn success, and constraints were not a problem. Serious players expected to have to cope with and take advantage of constraints. When hobby games were about interesting, non-trivial decisions, constraints were necessary. They were not a problem. But some rules constrain players more than others. Mastery and challenge go hand in hand with chess-like games and with classic games, but not with most of today's games. Some things that we now call games are characterized by their constraints, while others are more like playgrounds or toys, where players can usually do what they want. They are characterized by lack of constraints on player freedom. Usually there's no way to lose, although there are exceptions to that. Well, dislike of constraints is pretty common these days amongst contemporary players, contemporary hobby game players. But it's not a new thing. We've always had dice games. More recently, we've had party games and family games. Generally what you might call casual games rather than serious games, where the players enjoyed the game for their participation without much, if any, responsibility. But this has now come into hobby games very strongly. Nowadays, many games are reward-based. The players and people in general expect to be rewarded for participation. That's why I call them playgrounds. Constraints get in the way. Now, when so many forms of games are wish fulfillment and not about interesting decisions, constraints interfere with player freedom. Old-time gamers appreciate constraints. It's much less common amongst younger players. Bob Dylan said, "I think of a hero as someone who understands the degree of responsibility that comes with his freedom." And Eric Hoffer said, "There can be no real freedom without the freedom to fail." But there's no responsibility in many video games and some tabletop RPGs, no significant chance to fail. Constraints help put traditional style gamers in the classic situation on the horns of a dilemma, wanting to do more than they are able to do and having to make a choice. For those who don't take games seriously, fewer constraints are desirable, just as with party games. Some examples of typically constrained games are war games and their variants, battle games, conquest games, and many business-related games. And those are the kinds of games that many people do not like nowadays compared to formerly. Now I'm talking about games where there's an opponent, not a single-player game where essentially you cannot lose. In other words, people don't like to play against other people nearly as much as formerly. Party games, in contrast to those kind of games, set a broad constraint that encourages specific creativity and showing off. In many party games, you can't really lose. Maybe somebody keeps a score, but the idea is that it's fun for everybody. And nobody, even if they lose, they don't feel that they've lost because they enjoyed the activity. Puzzles and puzzles disguised as games, in other words, parallel competitions or multiplayer solitaire, like many Euro-style games, have at least one always correct solution. Puzzle's more about finding the solution in a passive setting usually than about overcoming obstacles in an active setting. What about collectible card games? Well, this kind of shows a contrast. In Magic the Gathering, the lands provide mana that is required to cast spells. In Yu-Gi-Oh, there are no lands and no mana. You just cast your spell. So some players really dislike the mana. To quote Mike Richard, who commented on one of my other videos, I prefer Yu-Gi-Oh over Magic the Gathering because of the mana curve difference between them. It is true that both games are as broken as checkers. I just hate delaying the game play over a mana screw. So he thinks of it as a mana screw, and it's a constraint that he does not like. Now, on the other hand, I recall at least one Magic player telling me that's why Magic is a superior game, and he meant as an intellectual activity, it's a superior game. Not saying that it was inherently more fun, just that it was a better intellectual activity.